Hello, my name is Craig Gamble, and I have just begun the second year of a PhD in archaeology at Birkbeck, University of London. My research considers the settlement character of the Thames in the London region during the late Iron Age. London is, of course, one of the best known cities in the world and has received an absolute mountain worth of study. The city is a living, breathing creature with a vast, rich global history. It's the birth and the early life of London that interest me, and for the next few minutes, I'd like to share with you my research aims as I explore one of the lesser understood aspects of this famous city. But first off, to set the scene, I'd like to attempt a whistle-stop tour of London from its earliest evolutions right through to our modern metropolis. So here goes. The Thames was originally joined to a great river called the Bidem, which emptied into the North Sea somewhere around Norfolk. During the Anglican glaciation, which started around 480,000 years ago, ice sheets were pushed down through Britain, completely destroying the Bidem and shifting the Thames into its current valley. About 100 to 200,000 years ago, we see evidence of mammoths and rhinos, hippos, brown bears, aurochs, tigers, even lions moving throughout London. An abundance of life which would surely have attracted other predatory species. There's evidence of migrating hunter-gatherer societies, probably moving along the Thames Valley, exploiting the rich resources it supplied. We see evidence in places like Uxbridge of Paleolithic tools and seasonal Mesolithic camps. The Neolithic arrives and we get farming and longhouses, ceramics, land intensification, and doing fancy things with big stones, although I don't think any remain in London. And now we're into the Bronze Age and we begin to see significant settlements, elite societies, deposition of metalwork in the Thames, cross-continental trade. We get swords and hordes and spears and hordes and axes and hordes, and it's all getting exciting and important, and the London region is absolutely booming. And then we get the Iron Age. Romans. Thank goodness, the Romans arrived with all their fancy gear, and they bring us technology and roads and art and leisure and buildings and trade and transport and temples. And what didn't they do for us? And then they pop off home, and we get Saxons on the Strand. And good old Miletus arrives with Augustine and becomes the first Bishop of London. Perhaps we even see the first St. Paul's. Vikings, pillaging and raiding and all that. But phew, Alfred moves us back into the city to be all civilized again. Normans! The Normans arrive and bring us a bigger St. Paul's Cathedral and the Tower of London. And the medieval period brings us all kinds of cool stuff. And plague. And then there's a Tudor Renaissance with art and theatre and boats for pirate stuff and more plague. Fire! We get a sharp-looking Charles I, but we also get an angry Oliver Cromwell who wants civil war. So Charles loses his head. But we get Restoration and Georgian decadence, industrialization, empire, war, skyscrapers, technology, and finally we are here. Oh, and plague again. Now, granted, that was a woefully lacking in detail and occasionally historically inaccurate little description of the last 500,000 years of London, but what I hope you took away from it was the apparent gap in our Iron Age knowledge. Of course, I exaggerate somewhat. There are traces of Iron Age activity in London. In fact, some of it makes up our most treasured and awe-inspiring National Museum exhibits. But if you've ever indulged in the history of London, you will no doubt have heard it described as a city born with the arrival of the Romans. Here's a few examples of how prominent London scholars have described London during the immediate pre-Roman era. In 1911, Francis Haverfield claimed, not only was there no pre-Roman Londinium, But even in the early days of the Roman occupation, the Roman Londinium, which roughly coincides with our city, did not yet exist. This address all but cemented a mass exodus of attempts to suggest anything significant existed in London prior to the arrival of the Romans in AD 43. And so it continued, with comments from Mortimer Wheeler in 1928 and Ralph Merrifield in 1965. In 1987, Nick Merriman wrote, "Previous synthesis have concluded that there would be at least some residual finds had an Iron Age settlement been directly superseded by the Roman one." In 1998, John Schofield and Kath Maloney continued the theme, and as recently as 2014, Lacey Wallace wrote, "Currently the lack of evidence for any substantial late Iron Age pre-Roman settlement is so strong as to be undeniable." The general consensus points towards a Roman foundation, yet this wasn't always the case. In the earliest histories of London, a pre-Roman settlement of great importance was frequently championed. During the medieval period, the idea of a pre-Roman London was widely accepted. Geoffrey of Monmouth was instrumental in this understanding, thanks to his famed folklorish and fantastical publication, The History of the Kings of Great Britain. It wasn't until the 16th century that these histories were convincingly challenged. Writers such as William Camden and John Stowe challenged the fanciful mythologies and looked instead to classical texts for depictions of the early inhabitants of London. Interestingly, these new interpretations coincided with English expansion into the Americas and contact with populations they considered to be barbarous and uncivilized, with these authors suggesting that England now took on the self-proclaimed Roman role of the great civilizer. The next significant shift came in the early 20th century, culminating in Francis Haverfield's address to the Society for the Promotion of Roman Studies. This address came during an era when the British Empire was almost at its greatest extent. Once again, we see archaic attitudes of enforcing civility on so-called savage populations, echoed by British colonial actions. Haverfield straight out dismissed any idea of a pre-Roman London and instead credited the Roman Empire with the foundation of the city. This seems to be a pivotal moment in the attitude towards pre-Roman London. It's from this paper that most preceding studies took their lead, the final nail in the coffin of pre-Roman London. For the Romans then, in varying levels, you may have heard London described as a backwater, a sparsely occupied green space of marshland and wooded hilltops, with perhaps the odd isolated farmstead dotted here and there. The Romans apparently arrived and chose this virgin territory to build what would soon become the most important city in the province. So I want to understand why there appears to be this gap. I'd like to highlight some of the issues and questions arising from the study of Iron Age London to understand why the idea of a mere handful of scattered farmsteads took prominence and whether it stands up to scrutiny. Whilst there's been a vast amount of archaeology in Greater London, there remain a number of issues regarding prehistoric evidence. The quality and accuracy of data has improved immeasurably since the earliest chance finds and selected reports, but issues remain with its legacy. So why do we see so little of London's later prehistory in the archaeological record compared to other eras? There's a number of problems to consider. There's been continuous, and in most cases extremely damaging, building work in London since the arrival of the Romans. Subsequent disturbance on sites is frequently found to truncate Iron Age deposits. Nick Holder and David Jameson recognised that in order to understand London's prehistory, it's necessary to understand the effects of massive groundworks and large-scale terracing which took place in the early Roman city. And during my data collection, I included a database of some of this quarrying activity. A survey of sites excavated in the city alone reveals that over 150 archaeological sites witnessed quarrying for sand, brick earth or gravel, with even more in the surrounding areas. The nature of these quarries and a requirement to reach significant depths means that many archaeological deposits would likely have been entirely obliterated. Mortimer Wheeler noted that medieval and Georgian building projects in the city caused significant damage and destruction to many earlier archaeological levels. Discussing the possibility of a pre-Roman village in the Walbrook Valley, Pitt Rivers complained that his argument could not be fully substantiated due to a large quantity of peat and its contents that had been carted away without an opportunity for study. And during 1960s excavations at St Paul's Cathedral, William Francis Grimes reported the site was cleared by machine overnight, with fleets of lorries taking away spoil so that opportunities for accurate recording were limited. And during the Holford redevelopment at Paternoster Square, he also noted that rapid mechanical excavation of this large site meant that many features, especially chalk walls in the middle of the site, were seen but could not be recorded, and only major features were recorded because of the nature of restrictions. It's a common theme of early excavation in London, and sadly the loss of material from these excavations can never be rectified. Millennia of natural erosion, gravel terracing, building works, excavations and disastrous damage have made it difficult to retrieve evidence of London's early environments. The best known Iron Age materials from London have come from the River Thames. Often the spectacular quality of this material and the lack of comparative finds during excavation has led to a ritual interpretation. London is frequently described as a boundary at the edge of opposing territories, and for that reason, high-status materials are thought to have been sacrificed here to the gods. However, the Thames saw a great deal of dredging activity in the 19th and early 20th century. Often, only items of historical or financial worth were kept. G.F. Lawrence noted that when the Pool of London was dredged, spoil was dumped on the foreshore at Hammersmith and Wandsworth. This could explain the discovery of artefacts in those areas. The true context is perhaps lost to us. So if everyone's convinced about the origin of London, you may ask why I'm spending years of my life scrutinising the evidence. In short, I think there are gaps, inconsistencies which fascinate me. Just like in my brief history of London, certain ideas become cemented in history. A persistent way of thinking all too easily becomes an accepted truth. London's origin seems to be an accepted truth, and I want to explore why that is. Now, my master's thesis, ridiculously titled Iron Diana Bones and the Temple of Doom, how uncertain evidence and fantastic fiction resulted in an invisible Iron Age on London's Western Hill, was a narrow exploration of the evidence fixed upon the Western Hill of the city. The study, though, inspired me to take a wider view of the Thames during this period. Indications of Iron Age activity are hidden amongst hundreds of excavation reports, grey literature, isolated discoveries, unpublished reports, and archival collections. I will tease out this material to gain a greater understanding of the character of London. Was the river being used for trade? Perhaps as a port for inland elite areas, or for transport from the interior right out to the Channel and the Rhine and beyond? Was it a significant town or a cluster of small settlements? Was it, as has been argued, merely a small scatter of farmsteads and a possible ritual area? What kind of communities were utilising the river, and what were they doing here? To direct my research, I produced a number of initial research questions. How similar were material assemblages from late Iron Age settlements and harbours along this region of the Thames? What does this tell us about connectivity between them, Oppido in Britain, and communities in Gaul, where imports were arriving from? And how did Roman conquest impact these settlements? Was the creation of Roman London inevitable, or could pre-existing centres along the Thames have competed for development? It's clear that one of the biggest challenges in this project is gathering the fractured snippets of evidence and bringing them into some kind of coherent database. In this database, I recorded location data, identifications, reference and publications, dates of discovery, dating of evidence, evidence typologies, and additional notes. I include spatial data for mapping purposes and have a simple scale to judge the accuracy of the data. The initial database covers Iron Age evidence within the M25, and it currently has over 2,500 rows and is still growing. This gazetteer has been created to pinpoint a number of key areas in which to conduct detailed case studies, and my case studies have now been selected, and I will analyse the sites to create a synthesis which illustrates the character of activity through a combined landscape perspective and material culture analysis. So let's talk maps. This is a map produced by the Museum of London, illustrating prehistoric discoveries in London. Iron Age evidence is indicated here in blue. Rather confusingly, so is the Upper Paleolithic and Mesolithic evidence. I can tell you that only about a third of those blue dots are actually Iron Age. All these maps show a similar sparse area with only slight scatters of activity. Now, I've created a few maps from my data so far. First of all, let me add a disclaimer that these maps are far from complete or definitively accurate. There's a great deal of data cleaning and additions to come. On these maps, the Thames is the dark blue line. The lightest blue is the worst case extent of the floodplain, but most interesting is the mid-blue, which indicates the main floodplain and probably the regular extent of the river during this period. So this first map shows early Iron Age evidence, and we can already see some interesting patterns here and some clusters emerging. Into the Middle Iron Age, there seems to be a drop in evidence, which is a little bit strange because in some of the reports and synthesis conducted up until now, the Middle Iron Age period is quite well represented. Perhaps this is due to larger defended enclosures taking prominence, people moving into dense nucleated settlements, and therefore less dots on a map, or maybe it indicates a genuine drop in activity. This map shows materials which are classified in a general Iron Age date, but with no more detailed dating possible. But you can see similar patterns on this map. And finally, this is my period of interest. It's the late Iron Age, and it's, as you can see, far busier. There's lots going on here, and there's some really interesting patterns emerging, which is exactly what I was hoping for. Just to show it's not all just random dots on a map, this here is a map of the distribution of coinage in the late Iron Age, shown in yellow, also with other metalwork deposits and funerary evidence, which is sadly extremely rare in this region. I will, of course, produce far more detailed maps as things progress. These were just initial maps at the start of the project. And these first maps were created to direct my choices for case study areas. As you can see by this useful heat map, there's some prominent areas which already show great potential. This helped me to select 3 case study areas for my research. Here's just a quick map showing all of the Iron Age points of interest from my data so far. And as you can see, it looks rather busier than those earlier published maps, and I would suggest indicates more than just a few scattered farmsteads. A few points of interest here. This is a temple site at Heathrow. This is a Opida, a potential Opida site at Ilford. And these lovely things are the Hounslow hoards and bronze figurines from Hounslow. Whilst I must say that this next map covers the whole Iron Age period and has not been cleaned in the way that some of my London data has, I think it still shows rather interesting potential. So here I've included the portable antiquity scheme data and historic environment records for the surrounding counties, just to briefly illustrate London and its wider environment. As you can see, there's some really interesting patterns showing up here. Some fascinating things happening and a very busy landscape. And if you're wondering what that busy bright red point in the centre was, that would be the City of London and suburb. As a final thought, I'd like to add another consideration. Since at least the turn of the 20th century, the idea of a Roman foundation has been widely accepted. This has had an effect on recording in the region. Material with distinct Iron Age features are frequently discovered in what are understood to be early Roman contexts. This is particularly the case for certain pottery types, stylistically very Iron Age in character, but dated no earlier than AD 43, due to its discovery in London. Brooches, commonly found in late Iron Age contexts elsewhere, are also found in London, but similarly assigned an early Roman date. There are even a significant number of indigenous structures, interpreted as native communities quickly flocking to the new Roman town. And this could very well be the case. However, I think it's worth exploring whether the lines could be far more blurred. So to wrap up, my research will explore the evidence for late Iron Age activity along the Thames in the London region. It will examine evidence from a wide range of sources, using a grade system to indicate the strength of the source. It will highlight activity in a number of case study areas, exploring the landscape, material culture, and human presence, before comparing the character of the region with better studied occupation sites in Britain and across the Channel. And finally, it will consider the effect of Roman conquest on the region and seek to answer the question: was the creation of Roman London inevitable, or could pre-existing centres along the Thames have competed for development? Thank you very much for listening.